The African man has been under attack for 800 years.
We have removed a lot of men's role models.
You need to have your stuff together.
The boy child should be empowered by men as role models.
I think the responsibility of empowering the boy child should be done by both men and women.
Our society needs to work harder.
This gender forum as part of the German Week. The German Week was organized by the German Embassy, basically presenting Germany and Kenya. And as part of this motto, the Heinrich Böll Foundation has also have hosted an open day in our office and an exhibition, Who I Am, Who We Are. And today we are having the Gender Forum. So we're talking about a society that is free of hierarchies, free of dependencies, and free of pre-prescribed roles, structural patterns of hegemonic masculinity. We will be looking at that from a Kenyan perspective and within the Kenyan context. In a nutshell, the question is our work, our efforts that are directed towards the emancipation of girls and women actually leaving men and boys behind?
There was a question about where is the space where you can have a really safe and frank conversation around masculinity. And we sat and we scratched our heads and said, where would that be? Somebody said, well, it happens in the bars. No, we're not looking for that sort of conversation. But we're saying, where can we have a space where we can now begin to address issues like, for example, what does it mean to be a man in the 21st century?
When I first started writing about men, the term masculinity didn't even exist. All we're trying to do was react to what we imagined was an unfair description of what men were like. And men of my generation, we felt unfairly judged by a standard that didn't seem to match up to what our expectations were. We came into an environment that had conditioned us to respect women as equals. However, when circumstances were changed, the flip side of that argument was that immediately went out, say, for a date. Social certain expectations were expected from me. I, as a man, was expected to at least pay for the date every so often. I, as the man, was expected to at least open the door. So we started to notice this dichotomy. And over time, I've realized we were forced to react. We found that our definition of manhood was always mirrored against a woman's. So you find guys growing into their 40s and 50s never ask themselves that innate question of who am I beyond this mirror that I have to play up to? As a new society in a different time, dealing with different circumstances, the fundamental question that men still need to ask themselves now is, who are you beyond the gender box?
Boys especially had a real dilemma when they were tiny. They didn't really know what men and women were about. And so they spent an awful lot of time watching their mother and their father, trying to figure it all out. Now, superficially, it's pretty easy for a boy to figure out what his mother's all about. But the father is a total mystery. So he spends all his time trying to figure out what fathers are all about. Now we have a generation in which it's often said, it's not really important to have a man in a boy's life. You know, really not important that if he's being brought up in a family with an absent father, that he should have a role model. I promise you it's hugely important. We are going to have to provide young men with meaningful role models that show how men should lead their lives.
What sort of role models should we be looking for in this day and age?
We need to be very, very careful when we're talking to boy children on, this is a role model. We need to be selecting these men on their character. We shouldn't be selecting them on their earning power, because there are plenty of askaris and men who sell, their small goods in kiosks, who are good fathers, who are responsible fathers, who are active in their children's life. But you will not find people saying, that's a role model. Why don't you sit down with the askari who guards your gate every day and talk to him about manhood? Because they're disqualified, because they're not rich. Whether he's a CEO of a corporate company or a guard that guards your house every day shouldn't matter.
Is there a historical perspective to why men behave the way they behave today?
Yes, I think we need to contextualize the conversation around African masculinities in history because it's informed us tremendously. And so what's happening is that we're living in a patriarchal structure that is telling men, this is the standard of manhood. Many men don't attain that standard. And what is happening is that there's a lot of questioning men in themselves about their male credentials. Patriarchal structure also has really problematic and debilitating effects on men. The African man has been under attack for 800 years. First it was slavery, where a lot of them were shipped off. Then colonialism came, and that violence was really brought into our villages, into our homes. And men were brutally beaten, attacked, and dehumanized. During the colonial economy, African men had to leave the village and go either to a plantation or to a town to find a job, to make money, to pay the taxes that the British had introduced. So what happened is that it seeded a culture of male absenteeism. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of boys were raised in homes that were essentially headed by their mother. What is the role of the man in the home? You know, the only role that I hear very strongly that men should have in African homes is disciplinarian. So I think we need to contextualize everything in history and, and understand that this story started a very long time ago. The boy child is not suffering because the girl child is being empowered for the past 20 years. This is a very ancient problem.
When we look at our identity as men, a lot of times we look at ourselves from the perspective of, the sexual structure of a man. And then we lose to look at the other aspects of, being a man. And so this is where men are finding themselves in a crisis, because each one of them is looking for power in one way or the other. The struggle to acquire power then removes a man from the responsibility that he's supposed to have for his family to be pursuing other interests.
I took a ngong mat coming to town and listening into the music. It's easy to see what vision that men have over women as sex objects, basically. How do we help? And is there a problem with this vision, actually?
One thing that we can begin to do is to begin to make the men understand their sexuality from the very early stages in schools, and also extend it to the men of our generation, because there's a crisis in that line.
We've grown these girls and boys telling girls, you must fight for your position. You know that this is a man's world, but the boys, as they grow up, we are telling them, oh, don't worry, your position is reserved. You know that you're the man, you're the leader, you're naturally a leader. So the boy grows complacent and knowing that my position is reserved. Eventually, we have the scenario that we do have.
Men need to decide whether they're going to look at the way patriarchy tells them to behave and see how unhealthy that is, and have the courage to say, you know what, I'm not going to follow that script patriarchy. I'm going to live by a life that is healthier for me, for my family, and for my community.
Is it true then that because there's no certainty of what a boy should grow up to be like, then do we see a situation, Oyunga Pala, where boys are now relying on the narrative that comes from popular culture?
What has happened, and this is unfortunate, we have to go back to the historical context, is that we had rites of passages that allowed men to transition from one stage to the other very clearly. This got disrupted. So we invariably had to find our new rites of passage that were mostly drawn from popular media. So we started basically finding ways to replace traditional rites of passage that had been lost. A very big one was sex. In a traditional society, we at least had an uncle. We at least had some crazy older cousin who would basically tell you, hey, walk with me to the river. This is how it's done. Now we have the internet, porn in every variation, and it's absolute confusion. Now, unless by some good fortune, unless by some luck, the actual individual in this process decides to look for some self-knowledge and find a place, say, of navigating sexuality beyond the physical level, he's never going to pass this stage. Yet, sexuality is a very huge defining factor of what it means to be a man. If we still refuse to address it, and specifically when we address it through a Western context that is not compatible with our reality as Africans, it's this confusion that we see playing around all around us. Sex has now become about, like everything else, instant gratification. The whole spiritual power of that force is dead. Spread across a widespread generation such as ours, the consequences are deadly. So we have to go back again to relook our society deeply and start saying, what's the phrase we use in Kenya? When did the rain start beating us? Where did we go wrong? And be very specific about how we can start effecting some change, some long-term change in these areas.
The conversation around gender equality is something that people should not look at as women trying to fix men. There is no society that can progress if there is no equality. And so the only conversation that we should be having in all spaces is how gender equality can be something that we all, first of all, believe in, understand, promote, and champion, for us then to have a society that is developed. We cannot move into a 21st, 22nd century where we are still talking about gender-based violence, sexual violence. We're still talking about women earning less than men for the same amount of work that they're doing. That is not an equal society, and an equal society cannot bring transformation.